Shkua për bisedën interaktiv të ndëruar. Shkues, do të flasim sonte në këtë emision me ish-ministrin e jashtëm të Kanadas, Lloyd Axworthy. Welcome to KTV and to Kosovo, Mr. Axworthy.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Thank you. Can you please first explain to our viewers your connections to Kosovo?
Well, that's a fairly big bundle to talk about, but I'd have to say that for good part of my career, Kosovo was very central to it. It may sound strange, we're 4,000 or 5,000 miles apart, but because of the involvement that we had at the time in the Balkans, both in peacekeeping as well as I was a foreign minister that was involved in the political diplomatic side, it meant that what happened here was really very crucial, very important. It was a topic of very strong interest in Canada and probably resulted in one of the most difficult decisions I ever had to make because when the diplomatic efforts failed to resolve the conflict and the kind of transgression or the kind of atrocities that were taking place, and the decision amongst our group was that there had to be an intervention. It was up to me to, on the instructions of our Prime Minister, to bring a recommendation back to the Cabinet of Canada as to whether we would participate in the armed force. And I can remember a Sunday afternoon on the Rideau Canal, which runs through Ottawa, sitting down with the minister of my local church. It was unusual here, but I'm a Protestant, so I can get away with a lot of things. And to really work out what the rationale would be to use force as a way of compelling the establishment of proper rights and protections and security for people. And Jim, if I could back up just for a minute, our foreign policy in Canada at the time, coming out of the sort of fall of the Berlin Wall, and we spent really serious time in foreign affairs talking about what should be our particular sort of direction, and we came up with what we called a human security sort of policy, which said that it is as important to defend and protect people as it is to defend nations and governments. That the increasing threat was to individuals, to groups of people, particularly to minorities. And so that really became the kind of lodestone, the center. And so when the things we had also experienced, and it was very vivid, and certainly my experience, what had happened in Rwanda with the genocide, Srebrenica that happened in Bosnia, the kind of merciless killing of innocent people by their governments or by those who are supported. I mean, it made no sense. And for those who like to trump around and call themselves sovereign states, you can't be a sovereign state if you don't protect your own people. So this came just at the time when we were wanting to demonstrate. And perhaps the most difficult but forceful demonstration would be to say we were prepared to become involved in a military action to provide a stoppage of the killing and of the expulsions and the ethnic cleansing. So I had to go to my cabinet and recommend that. And it was a very difficult decision, partly because my own religious background is not one that sort of lends itself to the use of force. I'm not a sort of one of those who thinks that you solve things always by force. But in this case, we did, and it was a very major turning point. And following up, we can talk later about how it created in Canada a series of initiatives that led to major changes at the United Nations.
Was it late to intervene, like more than 1 year after the war had already started, like almost 10,000 people were killed?
Yes. Well, you know, it's hard. In those days, you remember that there was very sort of limited support for any kind of intervention. I mean, when we were on the Security Council, and chairing the Security Council, we had to bring in a resolution that authorized UN peacekeepers to protect people. Up to then, they could only protect themselves. I mean, it was just, so it was a really evolving, growing understanding. And I want to pay tribute to Kofi Annan, who was then the Secretary General, who made very clear that governments should not hide behind the masquerade or the camouflage of sovereignty in order to commit atrocities on innocent people. And we wanted to pull the cover off that. And so it was late, but it happened. And I think I think Madeleine Albright played a very important role as the Secretary of State in bringing the U.S. on side, and a number of other. So we had the NATO commitment. We couldn't get a commitment from the Security Council because of Russia. And but what else is new? I mean, they're still doing today in Burma what they were doing in Kosovo 20 years ago.
And you were talking with Russians, right? At the time, like trying to convince them to stop Milosevic, right?
Yeah.
How
Well,
did that go?
We'd hoped that they could use their influence with the Serbs because they'd had a long historical relationship to, get them to stop and cease and desist, to use that formal language. But Russia at the time, as it does now, simply had a totally geopolitical view of things. Values, rights, those things just didn't count for anything.
How hard it was to have this resolution 1244, which is like very famous in Kosovo. Everyone knows that number, even though it's totally irrelevant for us today. But how did it go, to kind of bring Russia in it and have everyone agree for the resolution?
Well, I think it was partly because there was a growing public reaction, and they understand sort of very well the influence, and we're in an age where, unlike the past, where the diplomats in striped trousers would make the decisions inside closed corridors, it's now very public, and I think Russia was in danger of being named and shamed as an accomplice in the atrocities taking place. Also, I think the Russian government then was a little bit more flexible than the one we have now. And so there was Igor Ivanov, who was the foreign minister, who he and I were actually good friends. I mean, we enjoyed each other's company. And we had worked actually fairly closely with the Russians on nuclear disarmament issues. So we had a working relationship. And I think Madeleine Albright had a good relationship with Igor Ivanov. I mean, so there was a lot of personal sort of connections that helped to move the momentum along.
What was Canada's role in the bombing themselves, like your engagement?
Well, we contributed a fighter squadron. Let me give you a little history that's probably not as well known. As you know, the limits of the U.S. position was that they would get involved in an air intervention, but not on the ground. President Clinton, after what had happened in Somalia, had this kind of reaction against it. However, at the very same time, as we were debating and discussing what kind of intervention, there was a UN peacekeeping force in the region on the borders of Macedonia. It was there to try to hold back sort of people moving from Macedonia into Greece and other places. There were something like 3,000 UN peacekeepers in the area that could have moved here in 6 hours. And then what happened, and I think in this case, it was the Chinese, refused to extend the mandate of that peacekeeping force because they were ticked off with the Macedonian government because they didn't, I don't know, buy their washing machines or something, whatever the reason. So you had great powers abusing their power of the veto, and so the extension didn't take place. It would have been so much easier, of course, if those peacekeepers could have been moved into Kosovo or on its borders, and I think there would have been far less killing, far less conflict. But
For what time are we talking about?
this would be 97, 98. So they were already in place and had been for, I think, about 2 or 3 years. And they had a mandate from the Security Council, but to work on the Macedonia border. But that mandate could have easily been amended.
You think that could have stopped the war in Kosovo?
Could have stopped the war. It certainly could have sort of lessened the impact, yeah.
I want to talk about the refugees, you know. Canada being one of the leading countries taking thousands of Kosovars during the war. How it was perceived in Canada, this decision to take so many people?
Well, I'm glad you asked, because one of the reasons I'm in the area is to work on the refugee issue. I'm a fellow, what's called a Richard Weizsäcker Fellow at the Bosch Academy and Foundation, supports people to look at different public policy issues, international issues. And so I was appointed last year by the Bosch Academy to be a fellow and to focus in on refugee-related issues, partly because I had been the Minister of Immigration. Before I was Foreign Affairs, I had in my first cabinet post was the Minister of Employment Immigration, and that was at a time in which there was a major movement from Indochina. You recall the whole boat people. There was hundreds of thousands of refugees escaping in some of the situations we see today across the Mediterranean. Rickety boats, people dropping into the ocean, nowhere to go, oftentimes countries refusing to accept. And so again, I became involved in that as an immigration minister, along with a group of about 12 other countries, to realize that we had to change our refugee policy. So we amended it. We provided a series of discretions that the minister could use to identify a group of people who were being particularly abused, but also to undertake major refugee movements. So one of the things that we discovered at the time, or developed at the time rather, was the idea of personal sponsorships. Canadians could sponsor refugees, not just the government. And that has become really a trademark, I think, for our refugee policy. And right now, in today's world, with Syrian refugees coming in, over 50% are privately sponsored. So, but I'll tell you, Jim, what that did in Canada, it made Canadians take some ownership of the issue. They felt they were part of an important international effort to, again, help people. And so it had a certain impact just on public opinion. So right now, even though there's in most places around the world a rejection or a animosity towards refugees, Canadian support to the degree somewhere between 70–80% are in favor of promoting and accepting refugees. And that happened, of course, in Kosovo. It was because there was such an emergency. I mean, we were asked by the UNHCR that we just had to find some solution for all those who had been kicked out of Kosovo, who had been expelled.
Well, they reckon the liberals were in power at the time and the liberals are now. And it changes, right? Because the conservatives were prior to this government, and they're not very welcoming.
No, they don't have quite the same. Although I think a lot depends on personality as well. I mean, in Canada, while the Conservatives are a little center-right and we're a little center-left, we still have a strong center, and where we agree on things. And in this case,
I'm talking generally about policies, because I know how like Canadian people are very welcoming.
Yeah, welcoming, and I think, but they also felt that this is a good lesson for politicians and for bureaucrats and for those involved in government. The more you can have people feel involved in what they're doing, helping to affect the decisions that affect them, the more you're going to get public support. And oftentimes that's ignored. You know, people like to play the power game and sort of top-down decisions. Well, this was one that involved a lot of Canadians. I can tell you even now, you know, friends of mine will be sitting for dinner on a Sunday night, and they'll tell you that they have a neighborhood group that raise money, support a family coming, help the kids go to school, help the family go to shopping, so arrange sort of events, social events, going to a hockey game, whatever it may be. So all of a sudden, refugees arrive, feel a lot more welcome. They feel that there is a way of connecting with the general population. So it has a really, I mean, I don't want to oversell it. There's clearly always issues in immigration, but I think it's been as much a benefit to Canada to be able to have an open refugee system as it has been for those who are forced to come.
And the churches play a big role. They organize the churches as well?
Churches play a very important role. Right now, my wife, who is a teacher of English as a second language, for the last year has been working with the cities from Syria. Now that's a very, historically small minority, and they really keep to themselves. But they were a major target of the terrorists in Syria and Iraq. So they've come to Canada, but they're being sponsored by a Jewish synagogue. And my wife, who isn't Jewish, was asked to come in because of her experience as a teacher. And all of a sudden, one night, my wife said to me, would you like to come to the City party? I said, what do you mean the City? These cities had put on their own dinner for all those volunteers. Now and it was, it lasted 2 or 3 hours, and there was music and dancing and lots of conversation. Now that's a good way for people who are coming to a new country to begin to feel that they're welcome.
Most of the refugees actually came back from Canada and other countries. In Kosovo, it was like, as you know, like 1 million people fled.
That's right.
During the war. Most of them came back, but thousands of them stayed in Canada and made Canada second home.
Well, I was going to say one of the reasons I think I feel sort of a good reason to come and see and to come to Kosovo. It has played such a role, and there's many sort of those who came as refugees are now playing important roles in Canada in politics and in entertainment and business. And that's our basic attitude. I know this sounds strange because there's such a nasty, ugly debate going on about receiving refugees or immigrants, as if somehow this is going to totally corrupt people's culture, whatever. Except our culture is made up of about 1,500 different strands of civilizations. But in Canada, we've evolved to the point, and I can speak about this directly because my son-in-law and he has friends, we talk about this. And he said, look, I really don't care what people wear or what they worship or what they eat, as long as they live up to the law of Canada. As long as they are law-abiding citizens, that's all. I don't expect them to look like me or talk like me or whatever else. They have a right to make those choices. And what's happening is, I think those choices begin to enrich the country because it just brings in new thoughts and new cuisine and new ways of thinking. It was interesting, just a few months back, I was in Silicon Valley talking to a number of the high-powered sort of investors in digital technology. One of them was a a refugee who'd come from Sri Lanka, come to Canada, went to university in Waterloo, became a founder of Facebook, and is now a quasi-multi-billionaire. And it all happened, but that was the transition that he was able to make. So why people want to close doors, I just don't understand.
It's been like almost 20 years now. It is your first time here, but
yes.
How did you see Kosovo evolve on what you know and what you read? Obviously, we declared independence in 2008, 114 countries recognized by far.
Well, I've always maintained an interest. I mean, I'm not in government anymore. I'm sort of really working in the nonprofit sector. I chair the World Refugee Council now, as well as a couple of development agencies, and I have this fellowship from the Bosch Foundation. But I get to choose now. When I left government, I became a president of a university. So for 10 years, I paid penance for my sins of having to try to run a university. But now I'm liberated, so I can make some choices. But one of the choices is I just kind of kept, and I've always had a yen for coming here. I just wanted to see what happened after the intervention, because in some cases, the idea of the international community getting involved is now highly criticized by the academics and the experts and so on. And I'm saying, well, let me find out. You know, there's that basic rule, do no harm. But also, if you can do some good, then you should. And I want to find out. That's why I'm here. And I also particularly want to track more clearly the issues that related to refugees, both here and in the region.
It's been just a couple of hours, right? And you've, while we are recording this,
a couple of hours of sleep, you mean?
Yeah,
yes,
and you've just been like walking throughout the city, right? And that's all you saw. Like the first impression of what you see? Well,
you got great weather. Had a lovely walk down near the main street today. So far, I think it's. I've liked the feeling. Now it's very early. Lots of people to talk to. I'm with our Canadian ambassador, who's here, and I think he and his staff are very sort of committed to having a positive Canadian role here, and so I'm happy to do what I can. And as I listen to some of the issues, I guess the one thing that bothers me most is just the way other countries are trying to isolate Kosovo. And I think, again, there's something fundamentally wrong, that they're taking their own domestic sort of issues and trying to transfer them onto the international scene. And so maybe along the way I might be able to say something about that.
You're referring to Catalonia and Spain, are you?
Well, that's one, yeah.
No, they're not the same case, right? Kosovo and Catalonia.
Oh, no, they're not the same case, but there's this kind of mindset that's always been there. But I'm giving away a big secret. I'm going to probably write a major article in the Globe and Mail, which is our national newspaper, when I get back about Kosovo.
Okay, I hope you're going to have some good words, probably for us. Kosovo is the poorest country in Europe. The unemployment is high, and our main problem since liberation and independence has been the high level of political corruption and organized crime.
Right.
So I want to ask about your advice on how Kosovo politicians can tackle this and have better situation for people.
Well, there isn't any one single silver bullet or panacea. I just think the question of accountability, of having an open system and holding people account for their actions. And that means that the democracy has to work effectively. The parliaments and the councils have to be very careful about ensuring that everything is transparent. It's hard to do, but it's got to be transparency. And again, if I can speak from personal experience, I was an elected politician for 27 years. And when I was a minister, which I was for 14, 15 years of that, every day I'd have to go to Parliament and answer questions. And I didn't know where they were coming from or who was going to do them, but it just meant that I better be sure that what I was doing was the right thing, or at least I could say I believed it was the right thing. But if you open it up and make it transparent, you're called to account. And that's why I like our system, because you can't escape. You're always, not so much in a fishbowl. I mean, I'm not talking about people interfering in your private life, but in terms of your public life, you have to be completely open. As well as I think you've got to provide very significant, tough rules about financing of elections. One of the big, I think, dangers of virtually any democracy right now is too many rich people buying political parties or political favors. Lobbyists, companies. I mean, you see what's happening in the United States, where millions of dollars are spent on congressional elections. Well, in Canada, we have a very clear rule. Under our independent election commission, they set out how much per voter you can spend. So in my federal constituency, I think my limit when I left was about $85,000. Now, if I overspent that, I'd lose my seat. And that was a very clear rule. So you just have to work to get money out of the system. And if it means public financing, then that's the way to go.
When do you see Kosovo joining UN? Do you see Kosovo joining UN?
Well, I think that's probably where, if I could give advice, and maybe if I'm meeting the Prime Minister and President, I think Kosovo really, I know they're making lots of efforts, but you almost have to develop a Friends of Kosovo coalition at the UN, a group of maybe 5, 6, 8, 10 countries, along with some interest groups and those that would have an interest in support, and then start working at it. And you simply have to work, as I said in my old occupation, the politician, work the street. And I think in the UN, there's a lot of influence in New York itself and in Geneva, and there has to be a lot of work. But I think the starting point would be to get 5 or 6 key countries. They don't have to be big powers. It can be Sweden, it can be Mozambique, it can be Chile, it could be Canada, to say, we think it's about time that membership was established. Because there's no reason why not. I mean, compared to a lot of existing members, the fact that you've been able, overcoming the incredible pressure of having to come out of a conflict, the fact that you can still hold elections here and have some changes in the parties and people, I'm not saying it's perfect, but at least you've got elections that are legit, is, I would say, exceptional when you compare it to a lot of people who are bona fide members of the UN right now, where democracy is not something that is highly treasured.
But you'll have the Russian and the Chinese veto.
Yeah, sure. Well, you know, look, I never give up doing trades on those things. There's things that they're going to want too. And I think right now, I think Russia is increasing in trouble. I think it's in decline. I think its economy is based on what, oil, gas, and nuclear power. Doesn't have much else. It's not really modernized its economy very well. And they've got all these far-flung commitments out there in the Middle East and Ukraine, and their cyber attacks. And I think one of the things that will come about as a result of the investigations into the Russian meddling in the US elections, there's going to be much tougher rules applied to Russia. I know there's sanctions now. I'm not talking about sanctions. I'm just talking about rules of behavior. And if you're in our country, you're not going to be in the country if you're going to be meddling in our democratic way of doing things. So you know, the big player, of course, is going to be China. But China wants to become a leader in sustainable development. So maybe Kosovo has to establish a very effective sustainable development policy and say to the Chinese, hey, we'd like to work together with you. Now that's a kind of advice off the top. I haven't written a full policy briefing on it, but I just think you've always got to look. Back in my younger days, I used to play football, North American kind of. My basic talent, I wasn't that big, although I've since acquired more heft. But I knew how to look for a hole in the line and slip through it and get some yardage. And that's what you always got to be doing in international. You got to be looking for that.
Just the last one. I mean, our hopes and our eyes are always directed to USA, actually, which we see as the greatest ally of Kosovo. But with the changes there, with the Trump administration, we're just not sure what's going to happen with Kosovo.
Well, nobody is. I think, but I would simply go on the basis that the United States has a far-flung set of interests. I think the work they do here is important. Just don't let Mr. Trump find out.
but they're doing a great job. We won't. I thank you very much for being at KTV.
It's a great pleasure, and congratulations, because I know that you were one of those who came to Canada as a refugee and have come back and made a great success here. So great to be here.
It was a great pleasure, and obviously we're very thankful, me and my family, to Canadian people.
Terrific. Great.
Thank you.
Okay.
Ka qenë kjo biseda për sonte të ndëruar. Shkues do të kthehemi pas pak me rubrikat tjera. Qëndroni me ne.